dear colleagues, friends, and students. It's both a privilege and an honor to moderate this panel here tonight, this evening, on the Maqāmāt of Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī, Authorship, Texts and Contexts, which is the title of a book co-edited by two prominent scholars, Dr. Bilal and Dr. Maurice Pomerantz. And I'd like to welcome our discussant and friend, Dr. Vahid Behmardi. فأهلا وسهلا بكم جميعا. أتكلم قليلا بالعربية ثم نرجع إلى الإنجليزية. حين نتحدث عن المقامات فنحن نتحدث عن نوع أدبي أو ضرب أدبي عمره أكثر من 1000 سنة، أكثر من 1000 عام، وما زال مثار اهتمام الدارسين ما زال يثير اهتمامهم وعنايتهم ونقدهم، وقد تجددت العناية به منذ العقود بضع سنوات الأخيرة أو بضع عقود الأخيرة. وحين نذكر المقامات فالعلم الأول الذي يخطر بالبال هو من؟ بديع الزمان الهمذاني. بديع الزمان هذا لقبه أظن يدل عليه، فهو بديع، والبديع هو المبتدع، بدليل قوله تعالى بديع السماوات والأرض في سورة آل عمران وفي البقرة. بديع السماوات والأرض يعني مبتدع السماوات والأرض، فهو بديع بمعنى أنه قد ابتدع صنفا وإن يكن له سواء يعني ما سبقه، لكنه ابتدع صنفا أدبيا أو أسهم فيه إلى حد الابتداع، والابتداع هو الخلق. بديع الزمان، ومن حيث الزمن فما زالت أعماله عصية على الزمن، ما زالت باقية إلى يومنا هذا. أنا أعلم أن بعض الناس ما زال حتى اليوم يكتب المقامة باعتبارها فنا محددا، تغيرت لكن بقي منها عند بعض المحدثين السجعة، كل ما هو مسجوع في أو وبأسلوب قصصي فهو مقامة. كما قلت لقد تجددت العناية بالمقامات في العقود الأخيرة، وها نحن أمام عمل جديد في هذا الاتجاه يمثل عصارة جهد باحثين مرموقين أفرغا سنين طويلة في جمع مخطوطات الهمداني، جمعها وتحقيقها وترجمتها وجدولتها والتعليق عليها وإرجاعها إلى أصولها، وهذا عمل لا يتقنه إلا قلة، ونحن أمام هذه القلة هذا المساء. كلكم يعرف أن أيدي المحققين قد عبثت بالمقامات كما عبثت بكثير من تراثنا، ولعل المثل الأشهر على ذلك 1000 ليلة وليلة. هذبت بين هلالين، يعني عبث بها تهذيبا واختصارا وتقديما وتأخيرا وحذفا وإثباتا، لم تسلم المقامات من هذا. والنصوص التي حققها محمد عبده لا تخرج عن هذا الإطار، أنها قد غيرت وقد عبث بها ولم تعد على صورتها الأصلية. فجاء هذان الباحثان وأعادا جزءا من المقامات إلى أصولها، رداها إلى أصولها ونشراها كما هي. هذا بالضبط ما فعله في المخطوطات الأربع التي لم ترد في طبعة محمد عبده، فضلا عن المقامة الطبية التي نشراها للمرة الأولى. أود هنا أن أبدي إعجابي ليس بالعمل كله فحسب، بل بالترجمة، ولأطلعكم على شيء من هذا. انظر إلى هذه الأسطر المختارة، سأقرأها بالعربية ثم أقرأ عليكم ترجمتها بالإنجليزية. فقال الإسكندري: كم نفقتها في الشهر حتى أقدمه سلفا؟ فقلت: 100 في الشهر تعينها على صروف الدهر. فقال: لعلك قست شهري بشهرك، إن أمري دون أمرك. فقلت: لا أنقصها عن هذا القدر أو أنقصها، جائز. فقال: هي طالق إن لم تعطها نفقة شهرين، دون الأجل تضربه وقبل الماء تشربه. فقالت المرأة: اتق الله أيها القاضي في بنات صغار، ليس لهن كادح سواه ولا كاد إلا إياه. لو أردت أن أترجم هذا لعجزت عن أن أجد شيئا مناسبا. انظروا كيف ترجمت إلى الإنجليزية واحكموا معي. Alexandrian said, "What monthly support do I owe so I can pay in advance?" I said, 100 ought to shield her from the workings of chance, advance and chance. Alexandria said, "It seems you've measured my month against yours. My affairs are far humbler than what you suppose." So I said, "I've decided I won't lower her stipend one bit." He said, "Well, then either you'll pay her stipend for 2 months more, or I'll divorce her as fast as you can drink a draft or before." The wife said, "Please, Qadi, fear God and show us mercy and rule in our favor. I have young daughters whose life depends on this man's labor." So I ordered the wife's stipend to be paid. In 2 months, they turned up seeking more aid. And the more you read, the more you find interesting parallels and interesting attempts to have this rhyme there. And يعني تشعر كأن الكلمات تنساب انسياب الماء، ليس فيها لا تقعر وليس فيها إسفاف في الترجمة، فهي يعني في الوسط تماما. شخصيا عندما كنت طالبا حتى في البكالوريا في المدارس الثانوية كنا نقرأ المقامات، وللأسف أن هذا في ظني لم يعد موجودا في المنهج. قرأنا ونحن طلاب في المرحلة الأخيرة يعني في البكالوريا الثانية 4 أو 5 مقامات، منها المقامة المضيرية طبعا وهي أشهرها. وأعجبت بالمقامة منذ تلك السن من الناحية اللغوية البحتة في البداية، لجمال التركيب والمفردات. ولقنا في ذلك الوقت أن المقامة في المقام الأول هي محاولة لتعليم الطلاب بعض الكلمات الغريبة أو بعض التراكيب غير السوية، ولم يعطينا أساتذتنا رغم يعني أنهم أعطونا الكثير البعد الأدبي للمقامة الذي وعيناه في فترة لاحقة. يعني صوروا لنا المقامة وكأنها شعر أدب تعليمي مثل الشعر التعليمي في ألفية ابن مالك مثلا وشروحها. المقامة أبعد من ذلك بكثير، ارتباطها الأدبي الاجتماعي الديني الفلسفي، وهذا ما حاول أن يثبته الباحثان. لن أطيل عليكم، أختم بهذه الطرفة التي وقعت لي مع المقامات. كما أخبرتكم أول مقامة اطلعت عليها هي المقامة المضيرية، وقد أعجبت وقتها بكلمة الكنيف اللي هي بيت الخلاء الحمام يعني، ووصف الكنيف اللي بيقول أنه يتمنى المرء أن يأكل فيه لأنه نظيف ولطيف إلى درجة. فصرت أستخدم تلك الكلمة للدعابة، أنه بدل الحمام أنه وين رايح على الكنيف كذا. ومرة كنت مدعوا إلى بيت زميل من زملائنا الآن متقاعد هو من دائرة السوسيولوجيا عند الدكتور حنفي، وكانت المرة الأولى التي أدخل فيها بيته. فبعد أن فرغنا من العشاء وقبل أن تقدم الحلوى أردت أن أغسل يدي ولم أكن أعرف أين الحمام، فقلت له: يا فلان أين كنيفكم؟ فقال لي: عفوا والله ما جبنا كنيف اليوم في عثمانلية. فصرت كلما أرى الكنافة يخطر على بالي الكنيف فأعف نفسي عن أكلها. على كل حال هذا لمجرد الدعابة. كما قلت نحن اليوم بإزاء عالمين جليلين أتحفانا بهذا الكتاب، وعالم آخر سيعلق على هذه المسائل، فأترك لكم الكلام ولكم الشكر جميعا. دكتور أورفالي، تحب تبدأ؟
Thank you, Dr. Baalbaki. It's an honor to have you moderate this panel, and I'm glad we have this on record that you're talking about the book. Now the book is even more valuable. More than 20 years ago, around 22 years ago, in one of Vahid Behmardi's classes, I heard a term I had not heard before, the maqama. I never had the chance to read Maqāmāt in high school or middle school. I thought they're funny. You know, that's the first impression. Of course, they're funny. I think we read the al-Maqāmā al-Baghdādiyya with you. I hope I have showed Vahid today that I did learn something in his classes. It's a book that he could have easily written himself, of course. In this class, and later, while studying at Yale University, I also took a class on the Maqāmāt at Yale. I have learned that Maqāmāt, singular Maqāmā, are a form of fictive short tales composed in rhymed prose, saja, that have had a long history in the literary languages of the Middle East, especially Arabic and Hebrew. Over the course of a millennium, the Maqāmā form and its near relatives traveled across most major areas in the Islamic world from Central Asia and beyond, becoming one of the most recognizable of pre-modern Arabic narrative types. This is one of the most important works in Middle Eastern literatures. The literature adib Abu al-Fadl Ahmad ibn al-Husayn al-Hamadhānī invented this form, the Maqāmā, while residing in the city of Nishapur in Central Asia in 380, 990. And of course, he's Badīʿ al-Zamān, as Dr. Baalbaki mentioned. The book, like its subject, so the Maqāmāt traveled widely, but also this book has been the product of many travels, of our own travels, real and imagined at the same time. We began our research on this book unexpectedly in the summer of 2011, right, around 11 years ago. Our initial plan had been to visit manuscript libraries in Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. We were planning to go to Turkey. However, because of the regional events, we could not go anywhere. I sympathize with this now after Corona also. We remained in the air-conditioned third floor of College Hall. Back then, College Hall had air conditioning. Was before the financial crisis. Fourth floor of College Hall at the American University of Beirut, and consulted the several manuscripts that we both had obtained of the Maqāmāt of al-Hamadhānī. I remember you had the Fatih manuscript, and I had the Yale manuscript at the time. The first few days led us to some exciting discoveries, and it was then that our travels in the company of Badīʿ al-Zamān began. I think this book traveled to most continents also. The book owes a great deal to many colleagues, really, including Beatrice Grundler, my PhD advisor, who first introduced us to each other. It was at the American Oriental Society, and she said at the time, "Oh, you should meet Maurice. You guys have plenty of things to talk about." And she was right. Ramzi Baalbaki, of course, the godfather of this Arabic department, his support has been truly unfailing. I cannot give him really his due of praise and of thanks, especially when it comes to questions of grammar, lexicography, but also supplies of chocolate. Always dark, albeit with light humor every morning. I would like also to thank our publisher, my colleague, Sonia Atasi from the English department, who first suggested, why don't you submit the book to this series, which she edits, of course. And she kept following. Without her constant reminders, this book could have taken, easily 5 more years. So thank you, Sonia. I have also taught undergraduate and graduate courses on the Maqāmāt at the American University of Beirut. And this book has been shaped by these courses in many ways. So I would like to thank all the students who took this course, undergrad and grad students. Maurice has, of course, been a friend, a companion, and a family member as well. Masha and the kids had to share him with me, of course. And with Badīʿ al-Zamān as well. So thank you, Masha, for your patience. Often people joke that as a team, Maurice and I, we resemble the 2 characters of the Maqāmāt, Abu al-Fatah and Isa ibn Hisham. There is disagreement between us, who is Abu al-Fatah and who is Isa. But so what is this book about, right? What's the idea of the book? Despite the large volume of studies on al-Hamadhānī's Maqāmāt and the increasing sense that the standard 19th century editions of the Maqāmāt were flawed, Scholars had not yet thoroughly examined the extant manuscript evidence available. In the year 2011, the authors of this book, Maurice and I, for the first time acquired digital images of the oldest manuscripts of al-Hamadhānī's Maqāmāt. Over the course of several years and through the kindness and generosity of many individuals, we gathered more than 40 manuscripts, including the major early witnesses to this important text. And truly, the colleagues in the field have been so generous with us. I remember Wadad al-Qadi gave us her manuscript collections. Everett Rawson gave advice, and Dimitri Gutas supported the projects also in many ways. Textual scholarship is often understood as aiming solely at the revelation of an alleged text, an original or the earliest version of a text to which later versions can be compared. While it cannot be denied that reconstructing the earliest possible layer of the textual tradition would be a useful starting point for future scholarship on the Maqāmāt, we also believe that through investigations of the manuscripts, we are also exploring other important aspects of the text's life. Texts have lives of their own. Relying solely on the flawed 19th century editions not only compromises the results of modern scholars' investigations of al-Hamadhānī's text, but also prevents us from appreciating the literary culture that created this work. How were the individual maqāmāt composed? How were they performed at the time? How were they recorded, lost, found, collected, transmitted? This book tells the story of the Maqāmāt of al-Hamadhānī. So it's a book, about the life of a book. We first set out rather naively, to edit the text. We thought, we'll just produce a critical edition of the text. But increasingly, we felt that we have to write this book to understand what's happening to and in the text. So we wrote this book to understand really what is happening. And we're still planning to produce a critical edition, but this book was just an initial step. The broad concerns of the book are divided into 3 sections: authorship, text, and contexts. Although there are some overlap across these fields, one constant is that each chapter in this volume, and this is a rule that we imposed on ourselves, that each chapter investigates an unstudied textual material related to al-Hamadhānī's Maqāmāt. So each chapter will rely on a manuscript that people have not studied. We hope that these studies encourage other scholars to continually revisit questions of textual history in their studies of pre-modern Arabic literature. So it's important to not just read a book or use a book, but to understand how this text became a book from the beginning. How did it appear in print so that we can use it? Part 1 of the book begins with 2 studies related to al-Hamadhānī's authorship. In chapter 1, we review several theories about al-Hamadhānī's reliance on earlier forms in the creation of the maqāmah, and provide an unedited fragment of a lost work by the well-known grammarian Ibn Faris, which may have been an important model upon which al-Hamadhānī had drawn. So there is a lot of scholarship, right? Where do the maqāmāt come from? Some theories that, he took it from Ibn Durayd, a hadith Ibn Durayd. One theory is that, which actually Dr. Behmardi poses, is that he was influenced by al-Jahiz, for example. One theory is that he took it from his teacher, Ibn Faris. There's just many theories. So we wanted to revisit this theory by focusing on a text of Ibn Faris that we discovered in manuscripts. By the way, I also learned about this text from Vahid, and he also gave me the manuscript of this text, the Leipzig manuscript. Chapter 2, entitled Assembling an Author, describes the way that al-Hamadhānī's individual maqāmas came to be included in manuscript collections in the years following his death. The study further suggests how al-Hamadhānī's collection of maqāmas grew larger after his death, possibly on account of the ascendant fame of the Maqāmāt al-Harīrī. So think about the maqāmāt as hadith, right? 40 hadith. Just like the Arba'in Nawawiyat. Haddathana Isa ibn Hisham, they're 40 hadith, right? And we now think that Hamadhānī wrote 40, just like Ibn Durayd wrote 40. We think also Hariri, because he tells us that he wrote 40, then added 10, right? And Hariri tells us this, so we end up with 50. So, but wait a minute, Hamadhānī, whom Hariri was imitating, wrote only 40. Now we have 50. So Hamadhānī had to grow after his death to become 50, right? So it's Hariri who came later, shaped actually Hamadhānī's text. How do the 40 become 50? That's a long story, right? Where do these texts come from? And we explain this in our book. Here we also, I think our contribution here is that we categorize the manuscripts of al-Hamadhānī into 3 different categories. The early corpus, which we use in our critical edition, the Ottoman corpus, which Muhammad Abdu has used, but also what we call the Iranian family. There are many texts that, and they're not very homogeneous, but they come from Iran at the time. Presumably from a madrasa, because we have, and also how these paratexts, like these commentaries, these words, difficult words in the margins, what do they tell us about the book and about the readership of the book and about the history of the book? We think this is extremely important because it's part of the life of the book. Now, part 2, texts, presents the addition of 4 maqamas attributed to al-Hamadhānī in the manuscript tradition that were not included in Muhammad Abdu's printing. Chapter 3, entitled A Lost Maqama on Medicine, provides the Maqāmāt of Badīʿ and discusses its relationship to other extant maqamas of al-Hamadhānī. Think about it, if someone discovers, it's very exciting, right? Because this is our first discovery. If someone today discovers a play by Shakespeare, right, that it would be on the news. And I think when I gave it to Tarif Khalidi, at the time he said, this should be in the first paper, first page in all the newspapers in the Arab world. A new maqama by Hamadhānī. It's very important. and then the next chapter is also 3 different maqamat, not only one maqama, the Sharifiyya, the Hamadhaniyya, and the Khatamiyya. And of course, the authenticity of this text. When you discover something, you have to discuss the authenticity of the text, and you need to use your tools as a critic. Like you open your toolbox, and this is where philology comes into use. And I remember the responses of the colleagues in the field. I will actually say them because they're a bit funny, and then I'll conclude. Of course, first person I call is Vahid. I tell him I discovered a new maqam of Hamadhānī. He's like, okay, 10 minutes, I'll be in your office. Vahid comes, does not say even hi, nothing, give me the maqama. And then he reads it. He said, okay, we're not discussing this. And then he told me later that it's too Hamadhānī. This is your term, too Hamadhānī. That it cannot actually be Hamadhānī because it's too Hamadhānī. Right? And you gave it to Everett Rawson. You were in New York at the time, and Everett said, I would like to think it is Hamadhānī. Then I give it to Wadad al-Qadi, and then Wadad tells me, oh, Bilal, don't be stupid. Of course it's Hamadhānī. So the reaction of the people, it's been very exciting, actually. Part 3 of the book, which is context, I think this is the part that relates most to me in the book, is the context of these maqamat. And in this part, we provide studies of several key maqamas of al-Hamadhānī. For example, in chapter 5, Adab and Metamorphosis, the Mawsiliyya, is an addition, translation, and a modern commentary on this maqama, in which Abu al-Fatih famously attempts to raise a dead man from the grave. The commentary identifies sources from which al-Hamadhānī may have drawn, affording modern readers further context with which to explore this tale. And here we see the use of the Quran, the use of the Hadith, the use of the Seerah, the use of poetry, the use of history, where the maqama is an interpretation of all of this, is a literary commentary on all of this, right? And in chapter 6 also, we continue this game, and it's titled What the Qadi Should Not Hear, the Shamiyya, provides the first scholarly edition of this maqama, which Abdo just totally removed it from the edition. It was totally inappropriate for him because of all the sexual terms used. But the study explores how this maqamat draws upon ideas about the limits of proper and improper speech. It uses this language of the jurists, right? What the qadi should not hear. Al-qadi la yasma' ma yakra is even a rule in Islamic law. It shows how Hamadhānī has mastered jurisprudence, right? How he's in continuous dialogue with the Islamic tradition, and how art is actually formed, right? If I always compare the maqamat to a painting. You look, it's interesting, but then spend more time with this painting, spend hours with this painting. It will start talking to you. It will start giving you its secrets, right? And the same with the maqamat. You read them. I always read them. I thought they're funny, but then when I come to study them, I discover how deep, how layered these texts are, and they start to give their beauty to you with time. Chapter 7 of the book, chapter 7 of the book is a 10th century commentary on the Maqāmāt of al-Hamadhānī. Offers a study and an edition of an unknown commentary on the Maqāmāt of al-Hamadhānī that we argue may have been an example of auto-commentary. So Hamadhānī is explaining actually his own text. This is absolutely exciting, right? We have, of course, examples of this in the tradition. We have Ibn al-Arabi, for example, writing Turjuman al-Ashwaq and then writing a commentary on Turjuman al-Ashwaq, but not this early, from the 10th century. And it's exciting because Hariri enjoyed many commentaries, but we don't know of commentaries of al-Hamadhānī's text. So now we actually know of one. Possibly it's Hamadhānī. Right? This is arguable. But anyway, our proposed interpretation has profound implications for how the Maqāmāt of al-Hamadhānī were understood by the first generations of readers, including the writers of the maqamas who followed him. The best part of this book is that it has not ended, really. We're preparing volume 2. We are also we're still working together daily, almost daily. And we're aiming to produce a number of new works on the maqamat. There is the critical edition, there is the translation, there is also the debate between Khwarizmi and al-Hamadhānī, which you will talk about. I'm extremely happy and honored to be presenting this book at my own institution where this book really was conceived and born. This book belongs to AUB. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Orfali, for this exciting presentation and for, first of all, for summarizing the contents of the book and then for telling us about the various dimensions which the maqama has. You said it has to do with Quran, with hadith, with tafsir, with tib, with lugha, and eventually what is adab, if not all these blend together. For egoistic reasons, I'd like to comment on the fact that there are two very famous lexicographers who come into the picture of maqamat, namely Ibn Faris, whom you've mentioned. Ibn Faris has two unique theories on Arabic, most important of which is the semantic fields, defining the various semantic fields which any root of Arabic might have. And the other one, which brings me into our guest, to Maurice, is Sahib ibn Abbad, who is the author of Al-Muhit fi al-Lugha, a huge lexicon which I have recently examined in depth for the purpose of writing my book on the history of Arabic lexicography. And that again is a very important lexicographer. I'm saying that because our guest, Dr. Maurice Pomerantz, is associate professor at NYU Abu Dhabi, and he's very well known for his book on As-Sahib bin Abbad, the illicit magic, As-Sahr al-Halal, the life and works of Sahib bin Abbad. I will not spend more time on that. He's well known to most of you, so I'll ask him please to present his own view of the book.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I very much think, actually, being here today, walking on the campus of AUB, walking back into College Hall, that this book sort of has come, and our work to some degree has come full circle. It started here. It's very much associated with even walking around this campus for me, definitely. One constant, I will say, over this time is the incredible hospitality I feel every time I come here. Dr. Bilal, my friend, Dr. Ramzi, Vahid, Dr. Vahid, the staff here, colleagues. Bilal has been a generous friend in that he's the most kind of generous friend because he shared his friends and colleagues with me. And so that has been a remarkable thing for my own life as a scholar and a person. I guess I'd like to start. My thought, books, we're sitting here at a book talk and we have a finished product here on some level, but I would like to say that books are almost never finished. Even when they go on the shelf, even when, for me in particular, I only start to understand the books that I work on after I'm done with them. And perhaps to the exasperation of Bilal, sometimes I would say, I really think X, Y, and Z should have gone in the book. But this is not really the liability it might seem. And as Dr. Bilal mentioned, we're happy now to have that most precious gift, the time to work on future work. And one of the things that was so exciting about this book to work on was that every now and again, we got a sense, a fleeting glimpse almost, of the courtly world that had produced Hamadhānī's work. What was the context? Where did these remarkable literary works come from? And for both of us, we had studied the courts and the sort of courtly world of the 10th century. That is, rulers inviting these literateurs to entertain them, to praise them, sometimes to do other things. Really a remarkable world that was kind of, for both of us, the introduction to Hamadhānī. Because in a way, I think Hamadhānī's Maqāmāt, one thing we could say about them is they almost abstract, if you can understand this, they abstract the experience of being a literateur. A literateur is sometimes like a beggar. A literateur uses eloquent language to get what he wants. A literateur has to be able to think on his feet. A literateur has to know his audience. And Hamadhānī, in his Maqāmāt, he basically seems to take that experience, abstract it, and show how powerful it is. But of course, they lack historical context. We actually, on some level, we don't know all we know, well, or at least as scholars, we haven't really explored that, let's say that. And really, towards the end of this project, we started to get interested, especially with this commentary, which I'll talk about a little bit later, about what could be the sources for kind of the world that produced Hamadhānī's Maqāmāt. Can we fill in these gaps? Can we kind of go from the abstract to the concrete? And one text, which we're working on right now, is a letter written by Hamadhānī himself, because we do have his a large corpus, a diwan of his letters that was edited a long time ago, at the end of the 19th century, but really has kind of been used mainly as a source of historical information about al-Hamadhānī, and not for thinking about, well, how is Hamadhānī presenting himself as a literateur? What are his interests? Why did he compose a work like this? And there are some remarkable clues that actually, while left out of this book, will definitely even be part of the next, I think could stand as a monograph on their own, but at least be something, an area that we're really working on at the moment. I'll give you a taste for kind of, it's a little bit like Shakespeare in Love, if you know the movie. The idea that we can kind of reach into the historical record and think about the literary creativity of a very creative person. So imagine, it's the year 380. Hamadhānī is coming on the road from Georgian, and he's robbed. They take everything from him as he's one stage, so very, very close, like a short ride from the city of Nishapur, which is a big city at the time, 100,000 people, really a place where he could make his name. A place where he'd come, clearly, to make his name. And he's young still. He's a young man. He's robbed bare. He's in tattered cloaks. He has nothing. By the way, if you've read the Maqāmāt, this sounds a lot like the opening to the Maqāmah Mawsiliyah. So Hamadhānī shows up in Nishapur with nothing. Well, he does what any good literateur would do. He goes to the home of the most famous of famous literati of that city, the extremely well-traveled Abu Bakr al-Khwarizmi. When he goes to this man's house, expecting regard, because of course, he is absolutely that kind of literateur. He can go into a room or a diwan and work wonders, the Dia Zaman. He goes there, however, and he's snubbed. He interprets this. He's not, Abu Bakr al-Khwarizmi does not treat him well. He looks perhaps at his clothes, sees what kind of man could this young man could be. So, like any good literateur, Hamadhānī for the next year plots his revenge. They exchange mean letters with one another, and finally, they actually have a literary debate. Hamadhānī challenges Khwarizmi to a literary duel, where basically the who's who of this very important city show up. And what's remarkable about this moment is that we actually have a letter written, of course, by Hamadhānī describing how he, I guess we'd say in American colloquial English, wiped the floor with Abu Bakr al-Khwarizmi. It's a remarkable document, however, not just simply as an ego document, perhaps, of Hamadhānī. I confessed to Bilal that why do I keep working on these authors I don't like personally? Sahib ibn Abbad was also not a lovely man. And Badi'a Zaman shows himself to be certainly quite an aggressive, it's blood sport. He's really after the older literateur Abu Bakr. So Hamadhānī later writes this kind of document, which is an incredible source for basically practical literary criticism, because what are they doing at this event? Well, they're showing off. They're asked to sort of produce, and certainly Hamadhānī is asked to produce certain kinds of literary feats. Like, for example, in one case, Hamadhānī writes a chancery letter backwards. It's really hard to write a chancery letter forwards. In fact, I believe a famous grammarian, is it Abu Sa'id al-Sayrafi, fails in this very task. So, some of the greatest lexicographers were at their wits' end to produce a beautiful letter just before a prince. Hamadhānī could write one, and he could write it backwards. The words, that is, not the letters. This kind of document then is kind of, I would say, it gives us access to really the voice of Hamadhānī and the way he presented himself as an author and an adib, but from a very different direction from the Maqāmāt. So that's one area where we're hoping to do a translation and an in-depth study. It's around 60 pages in the published edition. It is a long text, and one that really has not been mined. I call it, in fact, a maqama in Nishapur, because at the very moments he's actually having this debate with Abu Bakr al-Khwarizmi, he's writing the Maqāmāt, which actually sort of sent chills down my spine. I was like, wow, this is the world. And strangely, it has really not been used as a source for his work, understanding his work. The second area of our research, Professor Orfali has mentioned commentary and what a modern commentary is. We find, as scholars, on the one hand, there's been lots of translations of the Maqāmāt of al-Hamadhānī. Perhaps, I think it is one of the most widely translated of pre-modern Arabic texts. It's in 20 different languages. You can find, and soon to be 21, 22. I'm talking with the Korean translator at the moment, but Hamadhānī has been translated into Hungarian, Romanian, Finnish, I believe twice into French, 3 times into German. So it's a rich field, once in English, but a prose translation. So it's a rich field. However, as we study the text and we work on kind of the interpretation of the text, often we find moments where, really these translations, although they're often works of art in English, in Russian, certainly the Russian translation has been widely praised, in terms of reliability for students, in terms of doing justice to the kind of literary world of al-Hamadhānī and his kind of 10th century literary world, they actually often go astray. So one of the things we're doing before sort of launching into, producing a polished English translation, we're trying to work on the critical edition of the text and really figure out what we think this text means to us now. So I mentioned modern commentary. We now stand, because of the philological work that we've done, in a much better. So imagine you had a 10th century commentary, and it might be by al-Hamadhānī, it might be auto-commentary. And if it's not, I'll tell you, it's someone who knows this text really well. In fact, probably better than we do. The text, this commentary clues us into things that we would otherwise have missed. I could at some point give you examples of this, but for now I'll say that. Well, one example. I'll give you one example. In the Maqām al-Basriyya, Hamadhānī's trickster, his name is Abu al-Fath al-Iskandari. And Abu al-Fath is always complaining about the fact that his children are hungry and he has no money to feed them. It's just a standard thing that, of course, literati would say at courts. So it's an abstraction. That's what I mean by abstraction, saying things that are. We learn that he puts into the voice of his trickster, this is Hamadhānī, putting into the voice of his fictional character, Abu al-Fath, a verse of his teacher that was well known, Ibn Faris. He puts into, now that is a very, very curious thing to do. And one of the things that we started to think about, Hamadhānī's scholarship on the Maqāmāt of al-Hamadhānī has often been focused. The great Moroccan scholar Abdel Fattah Kilito has often talked about Hamadhānī's trickster, Abu al-Fath, as someone who's sort of mixing and playing with genres. He's kind of playing fast and loose with the Arabic literary tradition. One thing we didn't think about thus far as scholars is the way that Abu al-Fath, as fictive character, breaks the rules of the sort of philological ground rules. That is, he's engaging in a sariqa, a theft, which is brazen. Just quoting, and it's very funny, you kind of imagine that world in Nishapur, with those kinds of scholars among, the people sitting in that diwan would have known that this is his teacher's verse of poetry, and then you think to yourself, okay, Abu al-Fath is kind of, this trickster is kind of almost the creative imagination of a literature who's willing to do almost anything to steal from the best, to sort of quote that, the good poets borrow, great steal. They do reveal the kind of immediate philological context. That's something we're still very interested in. And so, these sorts of close readings, you'd imagine this is very close reading. Producing a critical edition is as close to close reading, if you understand what I mean by that you can get. You're really almost tagging along, sitting behind the author as he's writing these words. We're hoping that that work will allow us to produce both a critical edition that's perhaps more reliable, more reflective of the 10th century world, the 4th, 10th century world of al-Hamadhānī. But also when we turn to translate the work, we're also providing something that's actually, again, a little bit closer to the work as Hamadhānī and his fellows knew it. That's our ambition. So I'll leave it at that. That's the future. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pomerantz, for an interesting presentation in which you shed light on not only on the personality of Hamadhānī, but also on his relationship with his colleagues, with the scholars of his age, to really put him into context. Thank you again for that. Now we turn to our second guest, Dr. Vahid Behmardi, good friend, and he's known to most of you. He's Associate Professor of Arabic at the Lebanese American University. He has published on his main interest or focus of interest is research is on Arabic prose, Maqāmāt in particular, on tasawwuf, and as well as comparative literature, Arabic and Persian. He's fluent not only in Arabic and Persian, but in so many other languages. أهلا بك يا وحيد.
Thank you very much,
تفضل.
Dr. Baalbaki. Thank you very much. First, I would like to express my pleasure to be in the company of my former professor, Dr. Baalbaki, in the 80s when I was undergraduate and graduate. I learned a lot from him in matters related to language, and I still remember a lot and recollect many things that I have learned from Dr. Baalbaki. In fact, 2 days ago I was telling my students something about Lam al-Ta'rif and comparing it to Arabic. Why you told us, in 1982, if I'm not mistaken, that yes, I can remind you about why do we say Ramlat al-Bayda and not al-Ramla al-Bayda, when you were telling us about Habbat al-Hamqa by Sibawayh and Tariq Jdīda, مش الطريق الجديدة, and you said, this has an Aramic root. And I still remember that, and I repeated to my students. So I was a good student, Dr. Baalbaki. Allah astaghfirullah. And I'm also delighted to be with my two friends, Bilal and Maurice. And it's really a very pleasant evening to launch and introduce the publication of this book on Maqāmāt of Hamadhānī. Last night I took a paper and a pen to write an outline for what I should say for 15 minutes. Then, while I was looking at the paper and holding the pen, I said to myself, I have been associated with Hamadhānī for the past 37 years. And I have been, with Hamadhānī, working on Hamadhānī for the past 37 years, and I still teach him in my course on classical prose. I have been associated with Bilal for almost 19 years, and that's why, he has lost some of his hair. And so, Badīʿ al-Zamān, Bilal, Behmardi, B, and Baalbaki. So, it is in fact, so there is no need in fact to put any notes for talking about the book, about Badīʿ al-Zamān, about the work that was produced by Bilal and Maurice. And I like to start by remembering also one of my teachers when I was undergraduate and graduate student at AUB in the 80s, who is Dr. Wadad al-Qadi, who was mentioned by Bilal. I remember I took with her in 1983, I'm sorry, in 1985, a course on Maqāmāt Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī. That was the first thorough study that I had on Hamadhānī. And I wrote a paper for that graduate seminar. It was under the title الجبر والاختيار في مقامات بديع الزمان الحمداني. That was the title. I still have a copy of that paper. And I remember, in fact, Dr. Wadad, Allah Tawal Bamra, gave me a good grade. But in fact, she had only one very brief comment at the end of that paper. She wrote, and I still remember that, هنالك سر كبير في مقامات الهمداني لا بد أن يكتشف ذات يوم. That was the only thing she wrote. This remained in my mind, that there is in fact a mystery in the Maqāmāt of Hamadhānī. It is not, I mean, merely, you know, a text which has prose and sometimes uncommon words and all these things. There is something more than the text itself and the rhetorical part of the text. And this remained in my mind. And then, you know, when I went to Cambridge to do my PhD, my first intention was to write on Persian elements in the Arabic poetry of the early Abbasid period. And it's a long story. I don't want to take your time by talking about the details, how in fact I discovered that there are no Persian elements in the early Arabic Abbasid poetry. And that in fact led me to Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī, to talk about Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī as a major figure in the history of Arabic prose, one of the four major figures according to Ibn Shuhayd al-Andalusi. And he lived all his life in Persia. He never stepped into an Arab land. He was born in Hamadan, in the western regions of Persia, and all his trips were eastward until he reached Herat, where he died at the age of 40. So I was so much, in fact, into Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī that when I reached the age of 40, I was worried that I might die, to tell you the truth, because, you know, I was so much, in fact, into Badīʿ al-Zamān. So when I became 40, I said, who knows, maybe I will die also like Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī, because I have been so close to him. I hope not. I hope not. I want to wake up in the grave. That would have been catastrophic. So, and at the same time, he was a pillar of Arabic prose in a creative way. And this led to, in fact, writing about the regional categorization of Arabic literature, where if each region has its own culture and produces a certain type of literature, a certain type of prose. And during the last few years, you know, this led to thinking about something new that, you know, Bilal and Maurice have not tackled yet. The geometry of Maqāmāt Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī, or the architecture of Maqāmāt Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī, and trying to make a comparison between the geometry or the architecture of the Maqāmāt with the design of Persian carpets and medieval Persian buildings. I have been successful so far to some extent in this, and hopefully, you know, I wish, you know, this gathering was a discussion, because, you know, Bilal and Maurice, and of course before them Dr. Baalbaki, mentioned several points about Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī that require very nice, might be sometimes heated, discussion about the Maqāmāt and Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī. Like the issue of al-Maqāmāt of Badīʿ, Bilal told you his story with me about al-Maqāmāt of Badīʿ and how I rushed from LAU to AUB to see this maqama, and I was going to fall down in Jeanne d'Arc. في سبيل بديع الزمان. And how we argued about that. And but he skipped the last part of the story. On the following day, I wanted to prove to Bilal that it is not from Badīʿ. You remember, Bilal? That it's not from Badīʿ. So I spent, a couple of hours composing, in fact, a maqama. حدثنا عيسى بن هشام قال كنت so and so, and I tried to imitate بديع الزمان to the extent I could. And then from my office I called Bilal. قلت له بلال في عندي خبرية كتير مهمة. أنا كمان اكتشفت مقام جديد لبديع الزمان الحمداني. Bilal was excited also, but over the phone he said, oh, بدك أقرأ لك إياها? So I started reading, and first, he was impressed, and gradually he realized. So it did not work out properly at the end. So I have, in fact, a long history with Bilal over the maqamat, and of course over the Arabic literature in the Buwait period, in the 4th century. And I was his advisor when he wrote his MA thesis on Arabic literature during the Buwait period, and it was an excellent. It was, in fact, also the prelude for, a long journey that Bilal had with that type of literature. Also, Maurice talked about the munazara, the debate between Abu Bakr al-Khwarizmi and al-Hamadhānī. And, if we were now having a discussion, there is a lot, in fact, to talk about this. So you believed Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī in whatever he said in that debate. Okay, so this is something that we need, in fact, to discuss. The issue, in fact, is the maqamat a book or a compilation? This is also an issue that needs to be discussed. Did Badīʿ al-Zamān really authored a book or composed a number of maqamas, and they were compiled by someone either contemporary to Badīʿ al-Zamān or who came immediately after him, like Ibn Dust, who compiled his letters? This is a question that needs a lot of discussion. In the Munazara, he talks about hundreds of maqamat fil Qudya, whereas in fact all the maqamat here are not in the Qudya. And the number 40, I'm inclined to believe that the original maqamat was 40 maqamas. And the number 40 has, its own symbolism. And interestingly, al-Hariri came, as Bilal has mentioned, of course, and composed a book of maqamat. Now we can be sure that Maqāmāt al-Hariri is a book which was composed by Hamadhānī by Hariri, because he puts an introduction for that compilation. So it is, in fact, a comprehensive book, and there is, in fact, a sequence in the 50 maqamat of Hariri. We should not forget a third composer of maqamat who is not really appreciated as he deserves, and this makes the trilogy, in my opinion, Majma' al-Bahrain for al-Yaziji. So, and interestingly, Yaziji added 10 maqamas to the 50 of Hariri to compose 60 maqamas with a sequence. And in fact, all what Abu Bakr al-Khwarizmi, when Badīʿ al-Zamān started challenging him and telling him, can you write a letter that when you read it backward, it is the answer? Can you write a verse? Can you do this? Can you? And then al-Khwarizmi tells him, this is not literature anymore. هذه شعوذة. So this is not literature. He told him, أنت مشعوذ. Now, in fact, Nasif al-Yaziji implemented all those sha'wadat in his maqamat. So he showed that he could do what Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī claimed that he could do. Of course, I think, my time is getting over. There is a lot I can say, I'm getting old. Bilal is still young. Maurice is also young. All his hair is not white yet. So they have more years than what I have to continue working on Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī. I think, in fact, the sir, ذلك السر الكبير, that Dr. Wadad al-Qadi mentioned in 1985 has not been fully disclosed yet. There is a lot. I mean, Hamadhānī was a unique figure. He was not only a writer. Of course, as Maurice has mentioned, he was a very wicked person. The letters that he wrote to his father, really, Ibn Haram ma biyuktuba. So, but he was a genius and he was a creative person. And he did something, you mentioned about his, the comedy in his maqamat. They are all tragic comedies. Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī, I think, was one of the pioneers in creating what we call black comedy. Al-Commedia Sawda. Imagine al-Maqām al-Musaliyya, what Abu al-Fath al-Iskandari did with the body of the dead man. If that would be, when we read it, we all laugh. When I read it in class to my students, they all laugh. And then I tell them, imagine that this was happening to your father. I'm not going to say what they were doing to the body, but in fact, then they realize, in fact, this comedy embodies tragic. So Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī was the founder of black comedy. In fact, many of his, the maqamat, they are in fact theatrical pieces of literature. They have all the elements of a play. I remember when I was an undergraduate student at AUB, the drama club, they presented, in fact, a play in West Hall, which was, in fact, al-Maqām al-Madiriyya. I remember very well. So, those who say that, drama came from the West in the 19th century when, there was this interaction between Western literature and those who went and Tahtawi, etc. No, Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī put the foundation of the Arabic drama. And if we reconstruct many of his maqamas, they will turn up into perfect, dramas in classical Arabic. There is a lot more to say about that. The mystical dimension of the maqamat, the esoteric dimension of the maqamat. I have made a comparison in my PhD thesis between the story of Salaman wa Absal by Ibn Sina and, in fact, one of the maqamas of Iskandari. And, I have spent, 37 years working on Badīʿ al-Zamān. I can spend now 37 hours at least to talk about Badīʿ al-Zamān, but I will not keep you till tomorrow. But I really want to say that what Bilal and Maurice, of course, have been doing in the past years is very significant. And it will have, a stamp on a lot of what will be coming out in the forthcoming years in regard to literature, in regard to especially classical prose in Bilad al-Mashriq, in the eastern regions of the Abbasid Caliphate. And the trilogy of Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī, Abu Bakr al-Khwarizmi, and As-Sāḥib bin Abbad. As-Sihr al-Halal, Maurice stole it from the letter of As-Sāḥib bin Abbad to Ibn al-Amid, which was the only letter memorized by heart by Abu Bakr al-Khwarizmi, because he considered it as the most eloquent letter, and he used to read it by heart to his guests when they used to visit him. And Maurice realized that, and he, called his book As-Sihr al-Halal. And that's why, in fact, the work of Bilal and Maurice is Sihr Halal.
Thank you, Dr. Behmardi, for your interesting comments. We eagerly await the results of your research on the subject of the geometry of the maqama. You mentioned that it's like a Persian carpet, what is usually called namat. And namat, of course, is used as a pattern. So it's a pattern to be followed, and it was followed. Just to put things, it's a design, yeah.
It is a design.
Exactly. To put things into context, when this university started in 1866, there was a professor of medicine and there was a professor of Arabic from day one. And that professor of Arabic was Nasif al-Yazji, who added to the maqamat. So you see how this institution goes back has contributed a lot to the study of Arabic and Arabic literature. I think you want to have some time for a few questions.
Thank you, Dr. Behmardi. فضلك علينا كتير كبير أكيد. To get the book, it's available. It will be available by the end of the year, open access for free. If you need a copy, you can always email me, but we're also translating it to Arabic. Dr. Lina Al-Jamal has already translated it, and actually two students, Rawan Al-Hulu and Abdul Razzaq Al-Naimi, also copy edited it, and will be published very soon, and will be distributed also for free. So get in touch if you need a copy of the book.
We have time for a couple of questions. Anybody? عبد الرزاق.
شكرا لكم أساتذتي جميعا على هذا التقديم الرائع للكتاب والحديث عن الهمذاني. أريد أن أعلق على شيء من كلام الدكتور بهمردي فيما يتعلق في أن الهمذاني هل ألف كتابا هو المقامات أم كان يلقيها شفهيا. طبعا أنا حضرت كورس المقامات مع دكتور بلال، وكنا نفكر في شيء من هذا، وكتبت ورقة بعنوان تتحدث عن تقنيات الهمذاني في استثمار القرآن في عرض مقاماته. توصلت إلى أنه كان يأخذ لمحات من القصص القرآنية ومفردات قليلة من هذه القصص ويضعها في المقامة بأسلوب منظم، يعني يكتب المقامة بشكل غير مباشر على القصة القرآنية. لأربط هذا الشيء مع ما تحدثت عنه من أنه هل كتب كتابا في المقامات أم أنها كانت شفهية، أن هذا التنظيم في العرض لابد أنه كتب المقامات، ولكن ربما لم يساعفه الحظ في أن يجمعها في كتاب كامل. فأريد أن أسمع آراءكم جميعا في هذا. شكرا.
شكرا. فيما يتعلق بالأبعاد القرآنية في المقامات، لا شك في أن هنالك الكثير من هذه الأبعاد القرآنية، وهو أيضا من بواطن المقامات التي يجب أن يعني يبحث عنها حتى نصل إلى استنتاجات. وقد كان للعزيز هاني رمضان يعني خطوة في هذا المجال، ونشر مقالة حول هذا الموضوع ويرتبط بقضية الارتباط بين المقامة الأسدية وبعض الإشارات القرآنية، وهذا بحث يعني يطول. فيما يتعلق بالمقامات، إن كانت كتابا أو كانت مجموعة مقامات جمعت فيما بعد 40 أو إذا أقل أو أكثر، كمان هذا موضوع يبحث. لكن أنا أعتقد بأن المقامات التي تنسب أو المقامات التي يعني يمكن أن نسميها مقامات كتاب مقامات بديع الزمان الهمذاني هي 40 مقامة. لأنه مثلا المقامة السيمرية لا يمكن أن تكون مقامة كسائر المقامات. المقامة مثلا الخلفية هي نص مديح للخلف بن أحمد، مثل رسالة الصاحب بن عباد إلى ابن العميد، هي قصيدة منثورة في المديح في كل يعني خصائص القصيدة التقليدية: المقدمة في وصف البحر، التخلص، والمديح المباشر. فلأن الأدباء الفرس الذين كانوا يكتبون العربية في القرن الرابع الهجري لم يتمكنوا من اللحاق بشعراء العرب خاصة في بلاد الشام، وكان شعرهم أقل شأنا من شعراء العرب في بلاد الشام وفي بادية الشام، عوضوا عن ذلك بالنثر الذي كان يشتمل على جميع خصائص الشعر فيما عدا البحور الخليلية. وهذا أيضا بحث طويل آخر في الكتاب القادم إن شاء الله لبلال وموريس. أنا لم أقل هلأ في يعني بعض المصادر، وربما يعني لا أستطيع أن أصدقها 100%، تقول بأن كان لبديع الزمان الهمداني مجالس في الأدب وإلى ما هنالك، وفي نهاية كل مجلس كان يتلو مقامة من هذه المقامات للترفيه على طلبته. أنا لا أصدق هذا الأمر، لا أعتقد أن بديع الزمان الهمداني كان يعني مدرس له صفوف. بديع الزمان الهمداني يلا يلحق ينط من بلد لبلد ويضحك على هذا ويضحك على هذاك. أنا أعتقد بأنه كان يكتبها. هذه مقامات ليست نصوصا ارتجالية، هذه نصوص جلس بديع الزمان الهمداني وصنعها. هذه تدخل في إطار صنعة الكتابة وليست في إطار كتابة نص. هي صنعة كتابية لها هندستها وتنظيمها، وأوجدها بديع الزمان الهمداني حتى يعمل بها ويكتشف أسرارها من يأتي من بعده. السؤال هو يعني هل هو كتب المقامات لا شك بخطه بإيده كتبها، لكن هل هو الذي كتبها ووضعها في 40 مقامة بالترتيب الموجود الآن في نسخة طهران الحجرية ونسخ مخطوطات أخرى، أم أنها يعني كتبت فرادى وجمعت بعد ذلك في كتاب في مجموعة واحدة؟ وهذا أمر يحتاج إلى الكثير من البحث والدراسة، خاصة في تلك الطبعة هنالك الشرح الذي أشار إليه موريس. هل هذا الشرح لبديع الزمان الهمداني؟ هل هو لغيره؟ هل هو لابن دوس؟ هل هو لجامع الكتاب إذا كان هنالك جامع للكتاب؟ الله أعلم.
Have many questions except for one. I think so my son is okay. Thank you. See, I have a sense, especially obviously my questions for the authors. I have a sense you didn't really articulate why he actually wrote these different texts, etc. But my question is this: so if you're still kind of searching for the answers, why, and the context as you mentioned before, then my only question, the question that comes to my head is, do you think he tried to mystify the language, drawing on what Dr. Vahid said, by probably trying to somehow try to imitate the divine scripture, the Quran? This is the only question that actually comes to my head. The authors, thank you.
I don't think he was trying to imitate the Quran, but other literatures did, right? Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, it's possible. Ibn Muqaffa definitely did, and we have the text. It was published by Van Es, right? Other literatures did. I think Hamadhānī, his crisis is even bigger, right? His crisis is the crisis of what is literature and what is the role of the literature. Why is the most eloquent man in the Maqāmāt is always a beggar, right? And the maqamat themselves are a form of kudya. Like he's writing about a beggar who is asking for money, and he himself is asking for money through writing this text, like this meta aspect for it. I think they ask the question of what is the role of the literature? It's a crisis of literature at the time, right? And we find it in his letters too. And I think, as Maurice said, the letters, the poetry, and the maqamat, they feed into each other in terms of interpretation. And there is a lot to say actually about this. But also, you're right, we didn't engage with this in the book itself because other scholars did and did a good job with that. And I reference here Wadad al-Qadi in his art, Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī, and the art of masquerade, of the art of wearing masks, and also Devon Stewart as well. And the most important of all is Abdel Fattah Kilito, who did tackle this question. So we wanted to, if you want, the book is not an interpretation of the maqamat, right? The book is about the story of the maqamat. How did they get lost, expanded, how they were written, etc.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. It's a very interesting question. I might also, within our book, we're, I used to joke about us, we're perfect, textualists, in that often the interpretation is hidden in footnote 29 on page 310. We do have an opinion. We certainly have talked a great deal about how one might interpret these works, because in the end, how can you even, I mean, critical editions, although there's a sort of quasi-science to them, some of that, that's sort of getting into the mind of the author, sometimes you actually, it helps to have a deep intellectual engagement with the work. And I'll give you an example. In our book, we talk about this Mawsiliyya Maqāmah, which Dr. Behmardi mentioned. And in it, it's a curious maqāmah. The two protagonists, the narrator and the trickster, for want of better terms, come into a town, they see a funeral, and, well, the trickster character poses as a false prophet. It's very interesting. Why a false prophet? A man who can kind of almost create. What he can create is a scene. What he can create is entertainment. What he can create is kind of making you, or at least the audience in the book, believe that a dead man has in fact been risen from the dead only so long, or just long enough so that he can escape the derision and blows, but only after he's gotten his reward. Now, actually, it's very interesting to imagine that, sort of, what is then, you mentioned the crisis of literature. I mean, by our terms, literature and adab, they're quasi-related to one another. They're not perfect, perfectly synonymous, but in one way, they sort of make sense. This kind of almost, I mean, it's really like playing with the dead, playing with the sacred. That in some ways is actually what adab does. And that is kind of interesting, molding and shaping and entertaining. And there's kind of the crisis, I think, on display. There's critique on display of that. There's kind of, I mean, it's almost the predicament. I think what I said by abstraction, I just kind of meant it's the predicament of the adib on display.
Yes, I want to be more.
Just, I mean, in addition to what Maurice said, interestingly, in fact, Isa bin Hisham promised the villagers to resurrect their dead in 3 days.
Thank you. There's a question. We can take 2 more questions. I'll start with the lady, and then I'll give the floor to the gentleman over there.
مساء الخير. اشتغلت أنا آخر فترة على الرواية العربية المعاصرة. وفي كتير جدل حول علاقة المقامة بالرواية العربية المعاصرة. ليس هناك إجماع على الموضوع، بس بحسب عملكم على المقامات إلى أي مدى يمكننا أن نعتبر أن المقامة هي فعلا تشكل أصل السرد أو الرواية؟ يعني قال أنه المقامة put the foundation of drama. Did it put the foundation of the novel? إلى أي مدى؟
It's a very interesting question that many have posed, in fact, right? I cannot say no, right? Because definitely the maqama has an influence on the picaresque, for sure, that we know now. There are many books, you know, just not a new statement. There are many books about this. Even Monroe, right? Badi'a Zaman Hamdan and the art of the picaresque. And we know that it did have an influence on authors like Lazzarello and the Don Quixote. And this is the beginning of the Western novel, right? And yes, maybe there are interpretations of why Nasif al-Yazji actually wrote the Maqāmāt is to stop this, one of the interpretations, to stop this new genre that's invading the Arab world and etc. But the Maqāmāt could have been one of the sources. It may not have been. There are many other interesting narratives, the Arabian Nights, the Kalila wa Dimna, the big book of Bilal. There are just so many. But I want to complicate things even further. And in comparative literature now, they're talking about the non-Western novels, right? That they're novels in China. They're beautiful narratives from China, from Japan, from Central Asia, from so many other regions, right? So the novel is not just a Western genre. And there is a big debate, actually, on all of this. Our work does not engage with this, but one of the things that we got interested in recently, especially Maurice, and it's part of your book, because Maurice is writing a book on his own. Believe it or not, he does things, many things also on his own, and I do things on my own. But one of his, actually, if I may talk about it, is how the Orientalists got interested in the Maqāmāt. Why Sylvester de Sacy, for example, how he discovered the Maqāmāt, how Tahtawi discovered the Maqāmāt, but Shaidius and other scholars, which manuscripts were they using? And if you want to say more about this, I think it's very interesting.
Yes, we're sort of, I mean, just more broadly, when we think about the history of the Maqāmah, we often view it from a pretty a narrow way. Like there were these classical works, Hamadhānī, Hariri, even if we vault forward in time to Nasif al-Yazji. What is very interesting about Arabic histories of literature in Arabic, and this actually, on the one hand, this is like other global literatures and unlike many other global literatures. The Maqāmah had a life that was very long. In fact, we didn't really talk about that at all here, but Badi'a Zaman set in motion something that really lasted 1,000 years, and even by conventional, even by sometimes non-conventional understandings of the lifespan of the novel, it's actually just as long. And it traveled. Like the Maqāmāt of al-Hariri, you can find copies of that work. Now it traveled, of course, through madrasa education, but it was found, West Africa to China, basically by the 17th century. And actually, even you can find Maqāmāt being quoted in Brazil in 1830 by slaves. It's actually there are these a portion of the Maqāmāt of al-Hariri was thought to be an amulet. It is an amulet, it's a fictive amulet in the Maqāmāt of al-Hariri. And then slaves in Brazil during one of the great slave uprisings, actually, one of the things they would do to protect themselves would put these tokens on their bodies in Arabic. One of those texts is actually Hariri. It was discovered maybe 20 years ago by a Soviet-trained Orientalist. All of this is to say is that the histories of some of these well, let's say the Maqāmah, which we think of being very local, almost as sort of like this is, Arabic literature, but even at the time of Badīʿ al-Zamān al-Hamadhānī, it traveled really far, really fast. Within probably 30, 40 years, it's, the works are in al-Andalus. Al-Hariri's work was like a wildfire, in an era that that was only a world of manuscripts. The Maqāmāt traveled in ways, Hariri was a bestseller in a world that didn't have print. And such then influenced hundreds of years, really the Mamluk period, so the 12th to the 15th centuries. You see, basically, if you want to be a literateur, a lot of the poets wrote Maqāmāt. Now, they wrote them in a Haririan style, not a Hamadhānīan one. But really what we're seeing is actually, were we to look at Arabic literature differently, we would see actually a motive force within the Maqāmah has a history of its own. That's, it's not perhaps as rich as the novel, I wouldn't say that, but it is a history that over time, that's not actually just a couple of major works, classic works, and then silence. No, actually it's this long story of how this form was kind of, people kept reweaving on these forms. And in that sense, it becomes interesting then to compare to the novel in a different way. To sort of say, well, novels are stories they kind of picked up in Europe, let's say, at a particular day. And it's very contingent. It's not like, that's one story of the way literary production worked. And for, for the world of, the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, or for me, 4th, 5th, 6th, those centuries had their own dynamism and were actually quite very much, these works speak to the fact of a universalism. They themselves think of themselves as really important works of literature. Oh, really important works of literature.
Okay. Final question, gentleman over there.
Okay, سلامات سامعيننا. Okay. So رح حاول افكر على صوت عالي. Please bear with me. Disclaimer. أنا بفترة من حياتي مهووس بجيل ديليز وبفكرة الإشراق بالتالي على القاعدتين المعريتين اللي هن تبع ليت شعري ما الصحيح وإنه أقصى الاجتهاد هو الحدس والشك يعني. بكل الأحوال ليش نحن حاليا مش ملتفتين للمقاربة الديليزية تبع الفرق والتكرار بالنقد الأدبي؟ بصراحة ما بفهم شو يعني نقد أدبي لحد هلأ بس عم أقول يعني ليه كتير نحن بعدنا كتير بنحكي برولان بارت وموت الكاتب ولك كتير بنحكي عنه حس أكتر من اللازم. على هيدي القاعدة أنا يعني قدرت أعمل هاللينك الخفي إذا بدكن بين التكرار عند ديليز وعن الشيء اللي أستاذي أنت حكيت عنه اللي هو الديزاين اللي أنا من شي 3 أيام ما بعرف ليه تهيألي إنه موجود ديجا ومسميينه الميوزيكاليتي اللي هي غير الريتم غير النغم يعني ولكن موسيقانية إذا بدك الشيء اللي أنا لاحظت فيه إنه موجود عند شعر المتصوفي بالأساس. أنا لاحظته عند ابن الفارض ولاحظته عند غير المتصوفي من الجاحظ وغيره وبكتاب المواقف وبكتاب الفصول والغايات لأبو العلاء المعري اللي ما بعرف لما قال الأستاذ هون إنه ما بعرف حسيته مش صحيح الكتاب يعني بكل الأحوال.
بس سواء إذا كان عم بقلد القرآن
تمام. فكرتي عن معارضة القرآن أنا دايما كان عندي فكرة إنه أبو العلاء المعري كان شيت بوستر إنه كتابه بس إنه العنوان تبع اللزوميات لزوم ما لا يلزم. أنا بالنسبة لي هذا البيك تبع الرومانتيسيزم رومانتيك كوميدي إذا بدكم وأنا بتصور وصلت فكرتي لحد هلا ما عادش أحكي أكتر.
Beautiful. I engage with what you say in my classes in Sufi poetry, of course. I don't think we're interested in Barthes. He's not that interesting. Neither Foucault, actually. We're just not interested in the question of authorship. And I often joke when I go to comparative literature, to talks in comparative literature, right? I always tell my moderator there will be a question about authorship. Wait to hear. And it's always the case, right? There is a question about authorship. I don't think we're that interested as such in the question of the death of the author or what does an author do, etc. But talking about the tikrar, It's very interesting that in this text, you know the beginning. It's always حدثنا عيسى ibn Hisham قال, and you know the end. And it's fascinating. And you know that there will be a scene, perhaps two scenes, and you know that there will be a moment of kashf, right? This disclosure, or where you discover where the batal is. You know all of this, and still you're waiting to see how he's going to shock you every single time. Hey, I love it. I love this. You know the beginning, and you know the end, and you know the tricks, and you're still excited about it.
في الختام أشكر كل من شارك في هذه الندوة اللطيفة والمفيدة، وأشكر الحضور. وزيادة في الفائدة والمتعة، أنتم مدعوون إلى بعض الأطايب، لا أدري إن كانت الكنافة جزءا منها